Imagine a scholar who was offered the favor of kings, and who quietly turned away. Imagine a man whose name was spoken with reverence across the cities of his age, whose knowledge was sought by the powerful and the humble alike, who could have lived in comfort at the side of rulers, and who chose instead to keep his distance, to live simply, and at times even to disappear. Imagine a teacher so admired that thousands came to learn from him, and who wished, more than almost anything, to be left unknown. Imagine a man honored for his piety who feared that the honor itself might harm him. Imagine a voice that rulers wanted near them, which answered their invitations with a gentle and unshakable refusal. Imagine a master of sacred knowledge who believed that the surest way to lose his soul was to let the world reward him for having it. And imagine that he spent his whole life guarding against that danger, not the danger of poverty or obscurity, but the danger of being loved too much by the world. This is the story of such a man. His name was Sufyan al-Thawri. He lived more than 1200 years ago, in the early centuries of Islam, in a world of lamplit study circles and long desert roads, in an age when those who carried sacred knowledge were treasured, and when rulers understood that to have such men near them was a kind of power. He rose to the very summit of that world. He was called a leader among the scholars of his craft, and yet again and again, when the world reached out to honor him, he stepped back, because he was afraid of what its honor might do to his heart. We will follow his whole life tonight, slowly and gently, from his birth in the old city of Kufa to the height of his renown, through his lifelong refusal of power and position, into the quiet of his final years, and to his death far from the honors he had declined. It is a story about sincerity and fame, about conscience and power, about a man who possessed everything the world admires and spent his life refusing to be possessed by it. And across all the centuries between his world and ours, it leaves us with one quiet question that never quite fades. What is honor worth, if keeping it would cost you the very thing you were honored for? So settle in, and let your mind grow calm. There is no hurry here. We have a long and peaceful journey ahead, through a distant world and a single remarkable life. You do not need to remember every name or every date. You only need to rest, and to listen, and to let this old story carry you gently towards sleep. Wherever you are, however tired you feel, you are welcome here. Let the cares of the day grow quiet, and let us travel back together to a world that is more than 1,000 years old. Perhaps you have felt, in some small way, the pull at the center of this story. The pull between being admired and staying true, between the rewards the world offers and the quiet voice that wonders what those rewards might cost. Most of us never have to refuse the favor of kings, but almost everyone knows the smaller version of his struggle. The moment when something desirable is offered and a part of us senses that taking it would change who we are. Sufyan al-Thawri lived that struggle at its highest stakes and faced it more honestly than most. There is a strange comfort in keeping company with such a man as the night settles, a man who was not ruled by what he could have had. So as we begin the long walk back through his life, carry no burden of effort. You are not being asked to study or to remember. You are being invited to rest, and to let an old and true story unfold at its own unhurried pace. We will move slowly and gently, and there is nothing you need to do but listen, and let the calm of it settle over you like a blanket drawn up in the dark. To understand the man, we must first understand the world that made him. We must travel back to the 8th century, to the early generations of Islam, when the religion was still within living memory of its beginnings. The companions of the Prophet had passed, and so, mostly, had those who had known them. The age belonged now to a third generation, the followers of the followers, who carried forward what had been handed down to them. It was a time of immense care for memory, for in those years the great task was to preserve, faithfully and exactly, the words and deeds that had been entrusted to the community. At the heart of this world, in the land between the two rivers, stood the city of Kufa. It was a young city by the standards of the ancient world, founded in the early years of the Muslim expansion, but it had quickly become one of the great centers of learning and law. Its mosques and study circles drew scholars from far away. In its streets, the questions of how to live, how to worship, how to apply the sacred law to the affairs of daily life were debated and refined. To be raised in Kufa was to be raised among people who treated knowledge as the most serious matter in the world. It was an age of great political change as well. The long rule of one dynasty was giving way to another, and the center of power was shifting. New rulers were rising, building a vast state that stretched across many lands. We will not wade into the details of these struggles, for they are many and tangled, and our purpose is not to take sides in the disputes of that distant age. It is enough to know that it was a time when authority was being gathered into powerful hands, and when those hands reached out often toward the scholars, seeking their blessing, their counsel, and their nearness. For a ruler who wished to be seen as just, there was no better ornament than a famous and pious scholar at his court. And this, more than anything, is the tension we must carry into the story. It was a world that honored the learned and the devout, that lifted them up and sought them out, and the rewards it offered, the positions, the gifts, the closeness to power, were real and great. A scholar of high standing could live in comfort and influence if he chose. But the very same nearness to power that the world prized could also, quietly, change a man. It could soften his honesty, blunt his conscience, make him careful where he should be bold and silent where he should speak. Into this world a child would be born who saw that danger more clearly than almost anyone, and who built his entire life around refusing it. So let us leave the wide world behind now, and turn toward a single city, and a single household, where that child first opened his eyes among the books and the quiet talk of learned men. Let us linger a while longer in that early world, for the more clearly we can see it, the more we will understand the choices he made. The 8th century was a remarkable moment in the life of the young religion. The first generations, who had lived closest to the source, were passing away, and with them passed the living memory of the beginnings. Those who remained understood that a great responsibility had fallen to them. What had been carried in the hearts and memories of the earliest believers now had to be preserved with deliberate care, or it would be lost, or worse, distorted. This gave the scholarship of that age a particular seriousness, a weight that is hard to imagine in our own time of endless written records. When knowledge lives in memory, and is passed by word of mouth, every link in the chain matters enormously. A single careless transmitter, a single faulty memory, could corrupt what was handed on, and so the scholars of that age became guardians, watchmen over the integrity of what they carried. They developed an almost fierce attention to accuracy, a refusal to pass on what they could not vouch for. To be sloppy with a sacred tradition was, to them, a kind of betrayal. Kufa, the city of Sufyan's birth, was one of the great centers of this guardianship. It had been founded only a few generations earlier, in the first wave of the Muslim expansion, as a garrison town, but it had grown swiftly into something far greater, a city of scholars and jurists, of poets and grammarians, of fierce debates and crowded study circles. Knowledge was the lifeblood of the place. In its mosques, men sat in circles around the learned, and the murmur of recitation and discussion rose from dawn until the lamps were lit. To grow up in such a city, in a household already devoted to learning, was to be shaped by knowledge before one could even choose it. And there was a particular character to the learning of Kufa, a vigor and an independence. Its scholars were not afraid to reason, to debate, to develop their own considered positions. This was the soil in which Sufyan's mind was formed, a soil that prized both faithful memory and careful thought, both the preservation of what had been received and the courage to reason about how it should be applied. He would grow into a master of both, a man who could transmit a tradition with perfect care, and also reason about its meaning with independent judgment. We should also understand the place of the scholar in that society, for it bears directly on his story. A scholar of high standing was not a private figure, tucked away with his books. He was a public presence, a person to whom others looked for guidance, whose opinion carried weight, whose blessing was sought. The community honored its learned men, fed them, supported them, gathered around them. And the powerful, as we have seen, courted them. To be a great scholar was to be, inevitably, a figure of influence and renown, whether one wished it or not. This is part of what makes Sufyan's lifelong flight from honor so striking. He was not refusing something far away and easily declined. He was refusing the natural and constant pull of his own position, a pull that pressed on him every day of his public life. Into this world, then, the young Sufyan grew, gathering knowledge in the circles of Kufa, learning the careful disciplines of transmission, absorbing both the reverence for memory and the courage of independent thought that his city prized. He could not yet have known where these gifts would take him, nor what they would demand of him. He knew only the work in front of him, to receive what the learned had to give, to hold it faithfully, and to seek out more. The city was Kufa, in the land that we now call Iraq, and it was here, around the year 716, that Sufyan al-Thawri was born. The exact year is not certain, for record-keeping in those days was not what it is now, and the accounts differ a little. But it was around the early part of the 8th century, in this city of scholars, that his life began. His family carried a name, al-Thawri, that reached back to an ancestor of old, and more importantly for our story, his household was already touched by learning. His father was himself a transmitter of sacred traditions, a man who had received knowledge from the generation before and passed it on. This is a detail worth pausing on, for it means that Sufyan did not come to learning as a stranger. He was born into it. The careful work of receiving a tradition, holding it exactly, and handing it on faithfully was, for him, not a discipline he had to seek out in the world. It was the very air of his childhood home. We do not need to imagine these early years as more dramatic than they were. There is no need for tales of hardship or wonder. What matters is simpler and quieter. Here was a child in a learned household in one of the great centers of knowledge of his age, raised among people who treated the faithful preservation of sacred words as a sacred duty in itself. From his earliest years he would have heard the rhythms of transmission, the careful naming of who had said what, and from whom they had heard it, the patient chain of memory that stretched back toward the beginnings of the faith. It is said that he showed remarkable promise very young. We should hold such reports gently, as the praise of later admirers often gathers around a great man's childhood. But it does seem clear that he possessed, from early on, two gifts that would define him. The first was an extraordinary memory, a mind that could receive and hold vast amounts of material with precision. The second, rarer and more important, was a deep seriousness about accuracy, a refusal to pass on anything he was not sure of. In the science he would master, these two gifts together were everything. So the boy began his studies in Kufa, as was the custom, sitting in the circles of the learned. And here we must understand something about how knowledge moved in that world, for it shaped his entire life. There were no printed books to study from alone. Sacred knowledge passed from person to person, from a teacher who had heard it to a student who would hear it and carry it forward. To learn was to sit before a living teacher, to receive from his mouth what he had received from his own teacher, and so on back through the generations. A scholar's knowledge was therefore measured not only by what he knew, but by the soundness of the chain through which he had received it. This meant that a serious student could not stay in one place. He had to travel, sometimes for years, seeking out the most reliable teachers wherever they lived, gathering knowledge the way a careful merchant gathers only the finest goods. And the young Sufyan threw himself into this with a devotion that became legendary. He sat with a great many teachers, an enormous number by any reckoning, listening, recording, verifying. He was not content to hear a tradition once and move on. He wanted to be sure. He wanted to know that what he carried was true. Slowly, through this patient labor, his reputation began to grow. Among the many students who gathered in the circles of learning, he began to stand out, not only for how much he knew, but for how carefully he knew it. Other scholars came to trust what he transmitted, for they understood that he would not pass on anything doubtful. In a world where the entire value of knowledge rested on its reliability, this trust was the most precious thing a scholar could earn. And Sufyan was earning it. To understand what he became, we need to understand the science he gave his life to, the science of hadith. The word may be unfamiliar, but the idea is simple. The community treasured the words, actions, and example of the Prophet, and in the early generations these were preserved chiefly in memory, passed from one trustworthy person to another. As time went on, the danger grew that errors might creep in, or that words might be attributed to the Prophet that he had never spoken. And so a science arose to guard against this, a careful discipline of examining each report, asking who had transmitted it, whether they were trustworthy, whether their memory was sound, and whether the chain of transmission held together without a break. This was painstaking, demanding work, and it required exactly the gifts that Sufyan possessed. A master of this science had to hold in his mind not only the traditions themselves but the lives and reputations of countless transmitters, knowing who could be relied upon and who could not. He had to be a kind of judge, weighing evidence, detecting weakness, preserving the sound, and setting aside the doubtful. It was, in its way, a vast labor of love, undertaken so that future generations might receive what had been entrusted to the community as faithfully as possible. In this science, Sufyan rose to the very front rank. He traveled widely in its pursuit, gathering traditions in Kufa, in Basra, in the holy cities of the Hijaz, in Syria, and in the lands beyond. Wherever there were reliable teachers he went. And as his mastery grew, so did the honor in which he was held. He came to be given a title that, in that world, was among the highest a scholar of his craft could receive, a title naming him a leader among the scholars of hadith, a commander among those who preserved the sacred traditions. Among the masters of memory and transmission, he stood near the summit. We should be careful here not to drown the picture in technical detail, for our purpose is not to study the science but to understand the man. The simple truth is this: a young man born into learning, blessed with a powerful memory and an unusual seriousness about truth, had given himself completely to the faithful preservation of sacred knowledge, and had risen to be one of the most trusted and honored scholars of his age. By the standards of his world he had achieved something very great, and the world as it does began to take notice of him, and to want him. A certain tenderness comes with imagining those earliest years, and it is worth dwelling on them a little, for the roots of a life often hold the secret of its shape. Picture a household in Kufa in the early 8th century, a home not of wealth but of learning, where the most valued possession was not gold, but knowledge faithfully held. In such a home, a child would absorb, long before he could understand it, a certain reverence for truth, a sense that some things were too important to be treated carelessly. His father, by the accounts, was himself a man of the traditions, a transmitter who had received sacred knowledge and passed it on. This is no small detail. It means that the disciplines Sufyan would one day master were not foreign things he discovered in the wider world, but the very texture of his upbringing. He would have heard, from his earliest days, the careful speech of a man who weighed his words, who named his sources, who would not say a thing he was not sure of. The habits of a lifetime are often laid down so early that we never remember acquiring them. And it seems that the habit of scrupulous honesty about knowledge was laid into Sufyan before he could choose it. We should resist the temptation to fill these early years with invented drama or with the miracle tales that admirers sometimes attach to the childhoods of great men. The accounts that praise his early promise should be held gently, as the natural tendency of later generations to find greatness foreshadowed in a great man's youth. What we can say with confidence is simpler and truer. Here was a child raised in a city that treasured knowledge, in a family that lived by the careful transmission of sacred truth, and he grew up breathing that air. The seriousness that would define him was not imposed from outside. It grew from within, nurtured by everything around him. And we should picture, too, the city itself as it would have appeared to a child's eyes. Kufa was a place of constant intellectual life, its mosques filled with circles of learning, its streets carrying the murmur of debate and recitation. A boy growing up there could not help but encounter the learned at every turn, could not help but absorb the sense that to be a scholar was among the highest things a person could become. The whole atmosphere of the place pointed a gifted and serious child toward the life of knowledge, and Sufyan was both gifted and serious. As he grew, he began the formal work of learning, sitting in the circles of the teachers, receiving what they had to give. And here the particular cast of his mind began to show itself. He was not content merely to gather knowledge. He wanted to gather it correctly, to be certain of what he received, to verify and confirm rather than simply accept. This carefulness, unusual in one so young, marked him out. The teachers would have noticed it, the way a craftsman notices a young apprentice who handles the tools with unusual respect. Here was a mind built not for show but for truth. Consider how rare this quality is, and how much it would come to mean. Many people who are clever are not careful. They can dazzle, but they cannot always be trusted, because their cleverness serves their pride more than the truth. And many people who are careful are not gifted enough for their carefulness to matter much. Sufyan possessed both, the brilliance to master a vast and demanding body of knowledge, and the integrity to handle that knowledge with perfect honesty. It was the union of these two, gift and conscience, that would make him not merely learned but trusted, and trust, in his world, was the rarest and most valuable thing of all. So the foundations were laid, quietly, in those early years in Kufa. A serious boy in a learned home, in a city of scholars, forming the habits of a lifetime. Reverence for truth, carefulness in handling it, and a seriousness about the weight of sacred knowledge that he would carry to his grave. He could not yet have known what these foundations would be tested by, nor what they would one day cost him, but they were being laid, day by quiet day, in the ordinary rhythm of a learned childhood. Let us dwell longer on the craft he gave his life to, for it tells us much about the kind of man he was. The science of preserving the sacred traditions was not a matter of simply remembering words. It was a vast and rigorous discipline, and to master it required a particular cast of mind, one that valued truth above ease and accuracy above abundance. Consider what it asked of a scholar. Each tradition came with a chain of those who had transmitted it, reaching back, link by link, toward its source. To judge whether a tradition was sound, the scholar had to know each person in that chain, had to know whether they were honest, whether their memory was reliable, whether they had actually met the one they claimed to have heard from, whether anything in their character or their circumstances cast doubt on what they passed on. This meant holding in one's mind not only thousands of traditions, but the lives and reputations of the countless people who had carried them. It was a labor of staggering scope, and only a rare few could perform it at the highest level. Sufyan was one of those few. His memory, by every account, was extraordinary, but memory alone was not what set him apart. What set him apart was his scrupulousness, his refusal to pass on anything he was not sure of. In a world where a scholar's reputation could be built on the sheer quantity of traditions he could recite, Sufyan cared more for their soundness than their number. He would rather transmit less and be certain than transmit more and risk error. This caution, this almost painful honesty about the limits of what he knew, was the very heart of his greatness in the craft. And it required travel, endless travel, for the reliable teachers were scattered across many lands, and a tradition was only as good as the soundness of the chain through which one received it. So Sufyan went out into the world in search of knowledge, as the serious scholars of his age did. He gathered traditions in his native Kufa, and in Basra, the other great city of learning in his land. He journeyed to the holy cities of the Hijaz, where the memory of the beginnings was strong. He traveled to Syria, and to the lands beyond the rivers. Wherever there was a teacher whose chain was sound and whose memory was trusted, he made his way there to receive what they had to give. We can picture these journeys, though the accounts do not give us every detail. The long roads between the cities, traveled on foot or by beast, in heat and dust. The arrival in a new place, the seeking out of the learned, the patient sitting in their circles, the careful recording of what they transmitted, the verification, the cross-checking, the slow building of a vast and trustworthy store of knowledge. This was the work of decades, undertaken not for wealth or fame, which it did not directly bring, but for the love of preserving the truth faithfully. There is something quietly heroic in it, a heroism of patience and care rather than of drama, and it earned him, in time, the deepest kind of respect a scholar of his craft could receive, the trust of his peers. Other scholars came to rely on what he transmitted, knowing that he would not pass on the doubtful. When Sufyan vouched for a tradition, his word carried weight, because everyone knew how careful he was. This trust was worth more than any title, for it could not be granted by a ruler or bought with gold. It could only be earned, slowly, through a lifetime of demonstrated honesty, and Sufyan earned it as fully as any scholar of his age. It is worth noticing how perfectly this craft suited the man, and how it shaped the conviction that would define him. A life given to the faithful preservation of truth teaches a person, above all, the value of integrity. The whole enterprise rests on trust, on the assurance that the one who transmits will not lie, will not exaggerate, will not let any motive cloud his honesty. A scholar who would shade the truth for gain, or soften it to please a patron, would poison the very thing he was meant to preserve. Sufyan lived inside this logic so completely that it became the logic of his entire life. The same honesty that made him a trustworthy transmitter made him incapable of selling his conscience for the favor of the powerful. The craft and the character were one. To grasp the scale of his learning, it helps to consider the sheer breadth of those he studied with. The accounts tell us that his teachers were very many, a number so large that it speaks of a lifetime given wholly to the pursuit of sound knowledge. He did not learn from one or two masters and rest content. He sought out teacher after teacher in city after city, gathering from each what they had reliably preserved, building a store of knowledge drawn from many channels and tested against itself. This breadth had a purpose beyond mere abundance. When a scholar receives the same tradition through several independent chains, each tracing back to the source by a different route, he can be far more confident of its soundness than if he had received it through a single line. By learning from many, Sufyan could cross-check what he received, could weigh one chain against another, could distinguish the firmly established from the doubtful. His vast network of teachers was, in effect, a vast apparatus for verifying truth. The more widely he learned, the more certain he could be of what he carried, and he was as careful about his teachers as he was about the traditions themselves. To receive knowledge from a person was, in a sense, to vouch for them, to place one's trust in their honesty and their memory. So Sufyan attended not only to what was said but to who was saying it, to their character, their reliability, their care. He was building, through all this, not merely a collection of traditions, but a deep map of the trustworthy and the untrustworthy, a knowledge of the people who carried knowledge. This was the real expertise of the master of his craft, to know not only the words but the worth of those who transmitted them. This lifelong concern with the trustworthiness of people that we can best understand his wariness of rulers, for the two flowed from the same source. A man who has spent his life learning to judge whom he can rely upon, who has trained himself to detect the subtle signs of a compromised witness, develops a sharp eye for the ways that motive can corrupt testimony, and he would have seen, with that same sharp eye, how the motive of pleasing a powerful patron could corrupt a scholar just as surely as any other motive. The discernment he applied to the transmitters of tradition, he applied also to himself, and to the dangers that nearness to power posed to his own reliability before God. There is a saying reported of him that captures, with stark force, how he viewed the scholars who sought the favor of rulers. He is said to have spoken of how certain learned men used their position, their knowledge of the sacred texts, as a means of climbing toward worldly advantage, as if the sacred knowledge were merely a ladder by which to ascend to the favor of the powerful. We should treat the exact words gently, as a report passed down by those who admired him, but the image is striking and consistent with all we know of him. To Sufyan, to use sacred knowledge as a ladder toward worldly gain was a kind of betrayal of the knowledge itself, a turning of something holy into a mere instrument of ambition. He had given his life to preserving that knowledge faithfully, and the thought of seeing it cheapened in this way pained him deeply. This is why his refusals were never merely about his own comfort or his own purity, narrowly understood. They were about the integrity of knowledge itself. He understood that a scholar who sells his nearness to power, who uses his learning to climb, corrupts not only himself but the trust that the community places in the learned. When the people see scholars currying favor with rulers, they lose faith in the sincerity of all scholars, and the sacred knowledge that those scholars carry is tarnished in their eyes. By keeping himself clean of all this, Sufyan was guarding not only his own soul, but the dignity and trustworthiness of the whole enterprise to which he had given his life. So we can see, when we look closely, that all the threads of his life were woven from a single fiber. The careful boy, who would not pass on a doubtful tradition, became the careful man who would not accept a compromising honor. The scholar who judged the trustworthiness of transmitters judged also the trustworthiness of his own motives, and would not let them be corrupted. The reverence for truth that he learned in his father's house became the reverence that made him refuse the favor of kings. It was all one thing, all of a piece, a single sustained commitment to keeping faith with the truth, in his knowledge and in his life alike. Pause for a moment on the strangeness and the beauty of that age of memory, so different from our own. We live surrounded by the written and recorded word, able to capture any fact in an instant and retrieve it whenever we wish. We have largely forgotten what it means to hold knowledge in the mind alone, to carry it as a living thing, rather than to store it as a dead record. But in the world of Sufyan al-Thawri, knowledge lived chiefly in human memory, passed from heart to heart, kept alive by the disciplined remembering of those who treasured it. There is something both fragile and profound in this. Fragile, because memory can fail, because a chain of transmission is only as strong as its weakest link, because the death of a great scholar could mean the loss of treasures he carried in his mind alone. And profound, because knowledge held this way is never merely information. It is bound up with the lives of those who carry it, with their character, their devotion, their care. To receive a tradition from a trusted teacher was to receive more than words. It was to receive a relationship, a link in a living chain reaching back across the generations toward the source. This is why the character of the scholar mattered so much in that world, and why a man like Sufyan, whose integrity was beyond question, was treasured so deeply. In an age when knowledge lived in people, the trustworthiness of people was everything. A scholar of doubtful character cast doubt on everything he transmitted, however learned he might be. A scholar of perfect integrity gave his community confidence that what he carried was sound. Sufyan's refusal to compromise his sincerity was not, therefore, a private virtue only. It was a gift to everyone who relied on him, a guarantee that the knowledge passing through him had not been bent or tainted by any unworthy motive. We can see, then, that his lifelong guarding of his own heart served a purpose far larger than himself. In keeping his sincerity intact, he kept faith with everyone who trusted him, and with the sacred knowledge he carried, and with the generations not yet born who would one day receive what he had faithfully preserved. His integrity was a thread in the great chain of transmission, and he kept that thread strong and clean across his whole life, so that what passed through him would pass on undamaged. There is a quiet grandeur in that, a grandeur that has nothing to do with the honors he refused and everything to do with the trust he kept. Yet Sufyan was not only a preserver of traditions, he was also a thinker in his own right, a jurist who reasoned about how the sacred law should be understood and applied. This is the second pillar of his greatness, and it deserves its own quiet attention. In that age, the great question that occupied the learned was how to live rightly, how to take the guidance of the faith and apply it to the endless particular situations of human life. The traditions told them much, but life always presented new questions, and answering them required careful reasoning, weighing principles, drawing conclusions. Different scholars in different cities developed their own approaches, their own ways of moving from the sources to the rulings of daily life. Around the greatest of these scholars, schools of thought began to form, communities of students who learned and carried forward a particular master's way of reasoning. Sufyan became one of these masters. Through his deep knowledge of the traditions and his careful independent judgment, he developed his own approach to the law, and a school formed around it, known by his name. To found such a school was no small thing. It placed him among the leading jurists of his time, the men whose opinions shaped how ordinary people understood their obligations and lived their faith. He was sought out not only for the traditions he had preserved, but for his judgment on the difficult questions that the traditions alone could not settle. We should be honest in the telling about what became of this school, for it is part of the truth of his life. His school of law did not survive across the centuries the way some others did. The communities that carried forward the reasoning of certain other great jurists grew and endured, while his own faded in the generations after him. This is not a mark against him. History is full of such turns, and the fading of his school takes nothing away from the brilliance of the man or the soundness of his thought, which continued to influence others long after the school itself had gone. But it is worth noting, because it points to something deeper about how he is remembered. In the end, Sufyan al-Thawri is treasured less for an institution that outlived him than for the quality of his character, for the kind of man he was. And that is exactly as he might have wished it. For by now, his standing in the world was very high. He was a master of the sacred traditions, honored with one of the highest titles his craft could bestow. He was a founder of his own school of law, ranked among the leading jurists of the age. His knowledge was sought, his opinion valued, his name known across the cities of the Muslim world. He had reached, by the measures of his time, the summit of the scholarly life. And it was precisely at this height that the world began to reach out to him in a different way, not merely to learn from him, but to draw him close, to honor him with position and reward. The rulers of the age, first under one dynasty and then under the next, took notice of him. This was the natural way of that world. A ruler who wished to be seen as upholding the faith liked to have famous scholars near him. Their presence lent his rule the appearance of righteousness. Their counsel could guide his decisions, or at least be seen to. And their blessing, freely given, was worth a great deal in the eyes of the people. So the powerful sought out men like Sufyan, offering them positions of honor, places at court, judgeships, gifts, and the comfort and influence that came with all of these. For most scholars, Such an invitation was the crown of a successful life. To be sought by the powerful, to be offered a high position, to be given the means to live well, and to shape the affairs of the state, this was the reward that learning could finally bring. Many accepted, and many of them were good and sincere men who believed they could do more good near the seat of power than far from it. There is no need to judge them harshly. The choice was a real one, with honest arguments on both sides. But when the offers came to Sufyan, he declined them. Not once, but consistently, throughout his life. When positions of honor were offered, he turned them down. When rulers sought his nearness, he kept his distance. When the world held out everything it had to give, the comfort, the influence, the standing, he gently and firmly refused. And this refusal, repeated again and again across his life, became one of the defining marks of who he was. It is worth pausing to feel how strange this would have seemed to many who watched. Here was a man who had every reason to accept. He had earned his standing honestly. The positions offered to him were not corrupt in themselves. He could have done good with the influence, eased his own life, helped others, all while remaining a scholar. By the ordinary reasoning of the world, refusing made little sense, and yet he refused, and kept refusing, and the consistency of it puzzled and impressed the people of his age in equal measure. To understand why, we have to look closely at what he feared. For his refusal was not stubbornness, and it was not pride. It grew from something he understood about the human heart, something he had watched happen to others, and was determined should not happen to him. He had seen what nearness to power could do to a sincere soul. And he had decided that no honor the world could offer was worth the risk of what accepting it might quietly do to him. To understand why his refusals mattered so much, and why they took the courage they did, we have to understand more about the relationship between scholars and rulers in his age. It was a relationship full of tension, and Sufyan stood at the very center of that tension throughout his life. The age in which he lived was one of great political transformation. The rule of one dynasty was giving way to that of another, and a vast new order was taking shape across the lands of Islam. We will not enter into the details of these changes, for they are complex, and the disputes of that age were bitter and are still debated. Our purpose is not to take any side in them. It is enough to understand the general shape of things, that power was being consolidated into the hands of mighty rulers who governed an enormous realm, and that these rulers understood the value of having the learned and the pious on their side. For a ruler, the support of respected scholars was worth a great deal. It lent legitimacy to his rule, suggesting that the religious learning of the age stood behind him. It gave him counsel, or at least the appearance of taking counsel from the wise, and it reassured the common people, who looked to the scholars for guidance and took comfort in seeing them honored at court. So the powerful sought out the great scholars, offered them positions and gifts and nearness, and hoped to bind their prestige to the service of the state. This put the scholars themselves in a delicate and difficult position. To accept the favor of a ruler was to gain influence, comfort, and the chance, perhaps, to do good from within the halls of power. But it was also to become, in some measure, dependent on that ruler, and a scholar who depended on a ruler's favor could not easily oppose him, could not speak the hard truth when it was needed, could not remain fully free. Every scholar of standing had to navigate this tension somehow. Some accepted positions and tried to use them well. Some accepted and were quietly compromised. Some refused. There was no easy answer, and good and sincere men disagreed about the right path. Sufyan's answer was to refuse, completely and consistently. He would not accept the positions offered to him. He would not draw near to the courts of the powerful. He would not allow himself to become dependent on anyone whose favor might later compromise his honesty. And he held to this, not only when it was easy, but when it was hard, not only in his prosperous middle years but to the very end of his life. when his refusal would cost him dearly. In an age when the pull toward power was immense, and when so many were drawn into its orbit, his steadfastness stood out like a single fixed point in a turning world. We should resist the urge to make this into a simple story of a righteous scholar against wicked rulers, for that would be neither fair nor accurate. The rulers of his age were not all villains, and the scholars who served them were not all corrupt. The truth is more subtle and more human. It is the truth that power, of its nature, exerts a pull on those who come near it, a pull that can slowly reshape even a sincere soul, and that resisting this pull requires a rare and constant vigilance. Sufyan possessed that vigilance. He understood the danger not as something out in the world, in the persons of bad rulers, but as something within, in the susceptibility of his own heart. And he guarded against it accordingly by keeping his distance, by wanting little, by refusing to be drawn in. This is what makes his example endure beyond the particular politics of his age. The dynasties he lived under are long gone. The specific positions he refused crumbled to dust centuries ago. But the dynamic he understood, the way that proximity to power and comfort can quietly erode the integrity of a sincere person, is as alive today as it was then. He saw it clearly, named it honestly, and built his life around resisting it. And that is why, more than 1,200 years later, his refusals still have the power to make us stop and think. We come now to the center of his story, to the conviction around which his whole life turned. It is a delicate thing to explain, and we must do it with care, for it is easily misunderstood. Let us walk through it slowly. What Sufyan feared was not power itself, nor wealth as such, nor even honor in the abstract. What he feared was what these things could do, quietly, and from within, to the sincerity of a person's faith. He had given his life to a single trust, the faithful preservation and teaching of sacred knowledge, and he had come to believe, with a depth of conviction that shaped his every choice, that this trust could only be kept by a heart that was sincere, a heart that sought the truth for its own sake and for the sake of God, and not for any reward the world might attach to it. The danger, as he saw it, was subtle. A man does not usually decide, in a single moment, to trade his integrity for comfort. The change is slower and quieter than that. He accepts a position, and with it comes a debt of gratitude to the one who gave it. He grows used to comfort, and begins, without noticing, to fear losing it. He sits near the powerful, and finds it harder to speak the hard truth they do not wish to hear. He is praised, and begins to enjoy the praise, and to shape himself, just slightly, toward earning more of it. None of these steps feels like corruption while it is happening. Each feels reasonable, even kind. But step by step, the heart that once sought only the truth comes to serve other masters, and the man does not realize what he has lost until it is gone. This was the danger Sufyan saw so clearly and feared so deeply. He believed that nearness to rulers, in particular, carried this danger in its most concentrated form. For the favor of a ruler is a powerful thing. It can lift a man high, and it can cast him down. To depend on it is to place oneself, in some measure, under its power, to have something precious that one is now afraid to lose. And a scholar who is afraid to lose the ruler's favor is a scholar who can no longer be fully honest, no longer fully free. His knowledge, however vast, becomes compromised at the root, because the heart behind it is no longer wholly sincere. It is reported that he warned others about this with great seriousness, urging them to beware of drawing close to those in power, to keep their distance from the courts of rulers, lest their faith be quietly eroded by the very nearness they sought. These were not the words of a man who hated rulers or who wished to rebel against them. They were the words of a man who understood the human heart, who knew how easily sincerity can be lost, and who loved the purity of his own faith too much to gamble it on the rewards of the world. Sit with that for a moment, quietly. Here was a man at the very height of his standing, offered everything that his world counted as success, and he looked at all of it and saw, not a reward, but a danger. He saw that the honor itself, the thing every ambitious man strives for, could be the very thing that destroyed what was best in him. And so he did the difficult, unusual thing. He refused. He chose to remain free, even if it meant remaining poor. He chose to keep his distance, even if it meant being thought strange. He chose the harder road of sincerity over the easier road of reward, again and again, for as long as he lived. This holds a particular kind of courage, quieter than the courage of the battlefield, but no less real. It is the courage to refuse what everyone around you is reaching for, to look at the prize that others would do anything to win, and to set it down, because you have seen something they have not, or feared something they have chosen to ignore. It is the courage to be misunderstood, to be thought foolish or proud or excessive, rather than to risk the slow corruption of your own soul. Sufyan had that courage, and he had it not for a moment, but across a lifetime. And we should be careful, in admiring him, not to turn him into something cold or harsh. His refusals did not come from contempt for the world, or from a sour spirit. They came from love, from a fierce protective love for the sincerity of his own heart, and for the trust he carried. He was, by the accounts of those who knew him, a man of deep feeling, often moved, often weighed down by the seriousness of the responsibility he bore. He counted among the great ascetics of the early generations, not because he despised life, but because he had seen what mattered most, and was unwilling to trade it for anything lesser. This, then, is the conviction at the center of his life. Not a hatred of the world, but a love of sincerity so deep that he would give up everything the world offered rather than risk losing it. It is the controlling truth of his whole story, the key that unlocks every choice he made. And once we understand it, the rest of his life comes into focus, not as a series of strange refusals, but as the consistent working out of a single, beautiful, demanding principle. Let us return to the great theme of his life, his refusal of the world's honors, and look at it more closely still, for it rewards a patient gaze. We have said that he feared what nearness to power could do to the heart. But it is worth understanding just how clear-eyed and deliberate this fear was, for it was not a vague unease. It was a settled understanding of how human beings are changed by what they accept. Sufyan had watched, no doubt, what happened to scholars who drew close to rulers. He had seen, perhaps, men of real learning and once real sincerity gradually transformed by their nearness to power. He had seen how the need to keep a patron's favor could bend a man's judgment, how the comfort of a position could make him cautious, how the habit of being honored could make him hungry for more honor. He had seen, perhaps, how a scholar who had once spoken the truth fearlessly grew careful and accommodating once he had something to lose, and he had resolved that this would not happen to him. It is reported that he spoke of this danger often, and with great seriousness. He is said to have warned those close to him against drawing near to the courts of rulers, against seeking their company and their favor. There is a saying attributed to him that captures the spirit of his stance, in which he warned a friend to beware of the rulers, of drawing close to them, and mixing with them in their affairs. We should treat such reported sayings gently, as words passed down by those who admired him. But the consistency of the reports, and the consistency of his life, leave little doubt about the conviction behind them. He genuinely believed that the safest path for a sincere soul was to keep its distance from worldly power. And there is another reported moment that reveals the depth of his stance. It is said that when he was asked why he would not even offer moral and religious counsel to the rulers, why he would not at least use his nearness to guide them toward good, he gave an answer that pointed to how far the corruption of power could reach. He suggested, in effect, that the tide of worldly power was so overwhelming that a single voice of counsel could do little against it, and that to imagine otherwise was itself a kind of self-deception, a way of justifying a nearness that would ultimately compromise the one who sought it. Whether or not the words are preserved exactly, the meaning is clear and consistent with everything else we know of him. He did not believe he could touch power without being touched by it in return. We should pause here to be fair and careful, for this is delicate ground. Sufyan's stance was not a condemnation of every scholar who chose differently. Many sincere and good men did accept positions near the powerful, believing they could do more good there than apart. And history does not record them all as having been corrupted. The choice was a genuine one, with honest reasoning on both sides. Sufyan's path was not the only righteous path, but it was his path, chosen with full awareness of what he was giving up, and held to with a consistency that commands respect whatever one concludes about the choice itself. What moves us in the end is not that he judged others, but that he judged himself so strictly. He did not trust himself to remain sincere amid the rewards of the world. He knew his own heart well enough to fear what it might do if given comfort and honor and power, and he loved his sincerity too much to take the risk. There is a deep humility in this, beneath the apparent severity. A prouder man might have assumed he could handle the temptations of power, that he was strong enough to stay pure amid the favors of kings. Sufyan made no such assumption about himself. He knew how subtle the corruption could be, how easily it could slip past a man's defenses, and he chose the only sure protection, to stay away from the danger altogether. And we should feel, too, the human cost of this choice, for it was real. To refuse the favor of the powerful was to choose a harder life, a poorer life, a poorer life. A life lived without the comforts and securities that his standing could easily have brought. It was to be, at times, misunderstood, thought strange or excessive by those who could not see what he saw. It was to bear his great fame as a burden rather than to cash it in for ease. He paid a price for his sincerity, paid it daily, across a lifetime, and he paid it willingly, because to him the alternative, the slow loss of the one thing he valued most, was no alternative at all. Let us sit a while longer with the inner life of this man, for it is the still center from which everything else flowed, and it rewards a patient and gentle attention. We have spoken of his fear of corruption, his refusal of power, his chosen simplicity. But beneath all of these lay something deeper, a particular relationship with his own conscience, and with God that gave his choices their force. By the accounts of those who knew him, Sufyan was a man of profound inwardness, often weighed down by the seriousness of the sacred matters he contemplated. He is reported to have been frequently moved, sometimes to tears, by the weight of what he carried, and by his awareness of standing always before God. This is worth understanding, for it explains much. His refusals were not the cold calculations of a man protecting an abstract principle. They flowed from a heart that felt keenly and constantly the seriousness of the account every soul must one day give. To such a heart, the rewards of the world looked very small beside the immense seriousness of remaining true. One way of being religious is mostly outward, concerned with appearances, with reputation, with being seen to be devout. And there is a way that is mostly inward, concerned above all with the secret state of the heart before God, with the sincerity that no one else can see. Sufyan belonged entirely to the second kind. What others thought of him mattered to him far less than what he truly was, in the unseen places of his own soul. And this is precisely why fame was such a burden to him, and why he valued obscurity. For the obscure man is free to attend to his inner state without the constant distortion of being watched. The famous man is always, in some measure, performing, and performance is the enemy of sincerity. We can feel, in the reports of his weeping and his heaviness of heart, the cost of living with such inwardness. To take the state of one's own soul so seriously, to examine one's motives so honestly, to refuse oneself the comforts that might dull that examination, is not an easy way to live. It is far easier to live on the surface, to take the world's rewards and the world's approval, to quiet the inner voice with comfort and distraction. Sufyan refused that ease. He chose to keep the inner voice clear, even though what it told him was often heavy, even though it demanded of him a constant vigilance that most people never undertake. And yet we should not imagine him as a man crushed by his own seriousness, for that would miss something essential. Beneath the heaviness there was, by all accounts, a profound peace, the peace of a man who has aligned his life with his deepest convictions and is not at war with himself. The misery in life often comes not from hardship but from division, from wanting two things that cannot both be had, from living one way while believing another. Sufyan did not suffer that division. What he believed and how he lived were one. He believed sincerity was the highest thing, and he lived sincerely. He believed nearness to power was a danger, and he kept his distance. There is a deep rest in such integrity, a rest that no amount of comfort can give to a divided soul. This is perhaps the quietest and most valuable lesson of his inner life, and it is one that speaks across all the centuries to anyone who hears it. The peace we long for is not finally to be found in getting what we want from the world. It is found in becoming the kind of person who is not at war with himself, whose outer life and inner convictions are one. Sufyan paid a high price in worldly terms for that integrity, the price of comfort, of ease, of the rewards he refused. But he gained something the world could not give him and could not take away: the deep, settled peace of a soul that is true to itself and to God. He was poor in the things the world counts, and rich in the one thing it cannot measure. To contemplate such a life, as we drift towards sleep, is itself a kind of rest, for it reminds us gently that the frantic pursuits that fill our waking hours are not, in the end, the measure of a life. A man can have very little of what the world prizes, and yet possess the deepest thing of all, a quiet and undivided heart. Sufyan had that, and the memory of it, handed down across more than 1,000 years, can quiet our own striving for a moment, and let us rest. If we want to see how deeply this conviction ran, we have only to look at how he lived. For Sufyan did not merely refuse grand positions while enjoying a comfortable life. He carried his principle into the smallest details of his days. He chose simplicity. He avoided the wealth and ease that his fame could easily have brought him. He kept his needs few, supported himself modestly, and guarded his independence as carefully as a poor man guards his last coin, though what he was guarding was worth far more than money. This simplicity was not misery, and we should not imagine it as a grim or punishing thing. It was, rather, a kind of freedom. A man who needs little cannot be bought. A man who has not grown used to comfort has nothing to lose by speaking the truth. By keeping his life simple, Sufyan kept himself free, free to be honest, free to refuse, free to remain exactly who he was regardless of who was offering him what. His simplicity was the practical foundation of his integrity. The two could not be separated. He was counted, for this reason, among the great ascetics of the early generations, those who had turned away from the world's comforts to keep their hearts fixed on what mattered. But his asceticism was never for show. He did not perform his simplicity to be admired for it, which would have been its own kind of corruption, the very thing he feared. He lived plainly because plain living kept him free, and he kept his reasons largely to himself, between his own soul and God. And yet, for all his desire to remain simple and unnoticed, fame pursued him. This is one of the quiet ironies of his life. The more he refused the world, the more the world admired him for it. His very reluctance to be honored made him more honored still. Students gathered around him in great numbers, eager to receive the sound traditions he had so carefully preserved. Scholars sought his judgment. His name spread far beyond the cities he lived in. The renown he had never sought, and did not want, settled upon him anyway. This was a genuine burden to him, not a pleasure. For a man whose deepest concern was the sincerity of his own heart, fame was not a reward but a test, and a dangerous one. Every admirer was a small temptation to pride. Every crowd was a small pull toward performing rather than simply being. He understood that a man can be corrupted by the praise of the pious just as surely as by the gold of kings, and perhaps more subtly, because the praise of the pious feels so much like a good thing. And so he guarded himself even against his own admirers, longing at times for the obscurity that his greatness would not permit him. It is reported that he praised being unknown, that he saw safety in obscurity and danger in renown. We can feel, in such reports, the weariness of a man who carried a fame he had never wanted, who would have traded all his honor for the freedom to be no one in particular, to worship and to learn and to live in peace without the weight of 1,000 eyes upon him. There is something deeply human in this, and deeply moving. The thing that others spent their lives chasing was the very thing he spent his life trying to escape. There is more to say about the way he lived, for his daily life was the truest expression of his convictions, more eloquent than any saying. A man's principles are easy to declare and hard to live, and it is in the small, unwatched choices of daily life that we see what a person truly believes. By this measure, Sufyan's life spoke clearly. He kept his needs few. He did not surround himself with the comforts that his fame could easily have commanded. Where another scholar of his standing might have accepted gifts, lived in ease, and enjoyed the material rewards of his renown, Sufyan held himself apart from all of that. He supported himself in modest ways, careful to remain independent, careful not to place himself in debt to anyone whose favor might later bind him. His poverty, if we can call it that, was not forced upon him by circumstance. It was chosen, a deliberate strategy for keeping his soul free, for he understood a simple truth about the human heart, that we are bound by what we are afraid to lose. A man with little to lose is a man who can speak freely, refuse boldly, and remain himself under pressure. A man who has grown accustomed to comfort, who fears poverty, who dreads losing his position, is a man who can be moved, pressured, quietly controlled. By keeping his life simple, Sufyan kept himself unbindable. There was no comfort he could not walk away from, no luxury whose loss he feared, and therefore no leverage by which the world could bend him. His simplicity was the armor of his integrity, and we should be careful, again, not to picture this as a joyless or harsh existence. The accounts suggest a man of deep feeling, not a cold ascetic. He was, by what is reported, often moved to tears by the weight of the sacred matters he contemplated, a man who felt the seriousness of his responsibility in his very bones. His simplicity was not the bitterness of one who hated the world, but the lightness of one who had set down a heavy burden, the burden of needing the world's approval and the world's goods. There can be a great peace in wanting little, a freedom that those who chase after much never know. Sufyan seems to have found that peace, even amid the fame that pressed upon him. But that fame was a real trial, and we should not underestimate it. For a man whose deepest care was the sincerity of his heart, being admired by multitudes was perhaps a greater danger than being courted by kings. The favor of a ruler is an obvious temptation, easily recognized and resisted. But the admiration of the pious is subtle. It feels like a good thing. It comes wrapped in the language of virtue. And precisely because it feels so righteous, it can slip past a man's defenses and feed his pride without his noticing. To be praised for one's holiness is one of the most spiritually dangerous things that can happen to a person, because it tempts one to become attached to the appearance of holiness, to perform virtue rather than simply to live it. Sufyan knew this danger and guarded against it. He is said to have valued obscurity, to have seen safety in being unknown and peril in renown. We can imagine the weariness of a man who could not go to the mosque without being surrounded, who could not transmit a tradition without a crowd gathering, who carried everywhere the weight of others' reverence. He had never sought this. He had sought only to learn, to preserve, to live sincerely. The fame had come unbidden, the natural consequence of his greatness, and he bore it as a burden, longing at times for the simple freedom of being no one in particular. There is something in this that speaks across the centuries to our own age, perhaps more sharply now than ever. We live in a time that prizes being seen, being known, being admired, a time when attention itself has become a kind of currency, eagerly pursued. Sufyan's life is a quiet rebuke to all of that, and a quiet comfort too. He shows us that there is another way to measure a life, not by how widely one is known, but by how truly one lives, not by the size of one's reputation, but by the integrity of one's heart. He had the fame that our age chases, and he found it a weight, and he longed to set it down. There is wisdom in that longing, and rest in it too. As the years passed, this longing for distance from the world deepened, and it shaped the final chapter of his life. In his last period, there came a disagreement between him and the authorities of his day. We will not dwell on the details of this dispute, for they belong to the tangled politics of that age, and our purpose is not to assign blame or take sides. What matters for our story is what he did. Rather than yield, rather than compromise the independence he had guarded all his life, he withdrew. He left the city that had been the center of his life, and he passed his final time away from public view, living quietly, out of the reach of those who might have wished to bind him to their purposes. A deep consistency runs through this ending. The man who had spent his whole life refusing to be drawn into the orbit of power, who had declined every position and kept his distance from every court, did not abandon that principle when it became difficult. When the choice came between his freedom and his safety, between his conscience and his comfort, he chose, as he always had, to keep his distance and his integrity, even at the cost of withdrawing from the world entirely. The refusal that had defined his life defined its closing too. And so his final years were quiet ones, lived away from the honors he had refused and the crowds he had never wanted. In the year 778, in the city of Basra, Sufyan al-Thawri died. We will not invent the scene of his passing, nor put words into his mouth, nor decorate his death with marvels. It is enough, and it is fitting, to say simply that a man who had spent his life guarding the sincerity of his heart came at last to the end of that life, far from the seats of power he had declined, having kept his freedom and his conscience intact to the last. Picture that ending gently. Not a great man surrounded by the powerful, not a death attended by kings, but a quiet passing, in a city by the river, of a man who had wanted nothing the world could give, and had given his whole life to something the world could not take away. He had reached the summit of honor, and he had refused to live there. He had been offered the favor of rulers, and he had kept his distance, and he ended as he had lived, free, simple, and sincere. The final chapter of his life deserves a closer and gentler look, for in it the whole meaning of his life comes to its quiet completion. We have said that in his last period a disagreement arose between him and the authorities of his day, and that rather than yield, he withdrew from public view. Let us dwell on what this withdrawal truly meant, for it was the last and perhaps the purest expression of the principle he had lived by. Imagine the situation. Here was a man of immense standing, known across the cities of the Muslim world, honored by scholars and sought by the powerful. The easy path, when a dispute arose with those in authority, would have been to find some accommodation, to soften his position, to make the small compromises that would let him keep his place and his peace. This is what most people do, and there is no great shame in it. The pressures of the world are real, and few have the strength to resist them indefinitely. But Sufyan was not most people, and he had spent his whole life preparing, though he could not have known it, for exactly such a test. When the choice came between compromising his independence and giving up his public life, he chose to give up his public life. He withdrew. He left the city that had been the center of his world, and he passed his final time away from the public eye, out of the reach of those who might have wished to bind him. We will not enter into the tangled details of the dispute itself, for they belong to the politics of that distant age, and our purpose is not to assign blame. What matters is the shape of his choice, and that shape is unmistakable. Faced with the demand to bend, he chose instead to disappear. There is something almost luminous in the consistency of this. For decades he had refused to be drawn into the orbit of power, refused the positions, refused the gifts, refused the nearness. He had built his whole life on the conviction that his independence and his sincerity were worth more than anything the world could offer. And when, at the very end, that conviction was put to its hardest test, when holding to it meant not merely declining honors, but giving up his place in the world altogether, he held to it still. The man who had refused to be bought would not, at the last, allow himself to be bound. He would rather vanish than compromise. We should feel the loneliness of this ending, but also its dignity. To withdraw from the world in one's final years, to leave behind the city and the circles and the public life that had been one's whole existence, is a hard and solitary thing. There would have been comfort in staying, in being surrounded by students and admirers to the end. He gave that up. He chose the harder, quieter path, as he had always chosen it, and he walked it alone. But there is a great dignity in such an ending, the dignity of a man who remained, to his final breath, exactly who he had always been. He did not soften with age, did not trade his principles for a comfortable old age, did not betray at the end the conviction he had held all his life. He finished as he had begun, free. And so his last days were spent in quiet, away from the honors he had refused, and the crowds he had never wanted, until in the year 778, in the city of Basra, his life came to its close. We will not invent the scene, nor imagine his final words, nor adorn his passing with marvels. To do so would be to betray the very honesty that defined him. It is enough, and it is fitting, to say that the man who had guarded his sincerity through every test of his life came at last to the end of it, his integrity intact, his freedom unbroken, his heart his own. A quiet completeness belongs to a life like this, the completeness of a circle closed. He began as a careful boy in a learned home, reverent toward the truth. He became a master of sacred knowledge, trusted above almost all his peers. He refused, again and again, the rewards that his greatness brought him, fearing what they might do to his heart. He lived simply, bore his fame as a burden, and longed for the obscurity his greatness would not permit. And at the end, when the world demanded that he bend, he chose instead to withdraw, to disappear, to keep his freedom even at the cost of everything else. The boy who revered the truth and the old man who vanished rather than compromise it were the same person, unchanged in the one thing that mattered, across a whole long life. That is a rare and beautiful kind of consistency, and it is the truest measure of the man. But his story did not end with his death. In a way, it had only begun to spread, for what he left behind would outlast him by many centuries, though not always in the form one might expect. His most lasting contribution lay in the sacred traditions he had so carefully preserved. The hadith he transmitted, gathered and verified across a lifetime of patient travel and study, passed into the great collections that later generations of scholars assembled. When those who came after him sought to preserve the sound traditions and set aside the doubtful, they relied, in part, on the careful work of men like Sufyan, whose scrupulous transmission had kept the chain of memory intact. In this way, his labor entered the deep foundations of the tradition, woven so thoroughly into it that countless people who never knew his name nonetheless received what he had helped to preserve. His legal thought, too, influenced the scholars who came after him, even as his own school faded. The great jurists of later ages engaged with his opinions, weighed his reasoning, and carried forward parts of his thought into their own work. His school did not endure as an institution, but his mind left its mark on those who followed, in the quiet way that a teacher's thinking lives on in students who never sat with him. We must be measured here, and resist the temptation to overstate, for the truth is impressive enough without exaggeration. He did not single-handedly shape the whole of his tradition, nor solve every question, nor found an institution that conquered the centuries. History is never the work of one man alone, and his own school, as we have said, did not long survive him. But it is fair and accurate to say that he became one of the great early masters of the sacred traditions, a founder of his own school of law, and one of the most respected scholars of his age, whose careful work entered the foundations of what came after, and whose example endured long after his school was gone. When we consider what he left behind, there is a quiet irony worth dwelling on, for it deepens rather than diminishes his greatness. The two great achievements of his public life met very different fates, and the difference tells us something about how a life's true worth is measured. His school of law, the structured system of legal reasoning that formed around him, did not endure. In the generations after his death, the communities that carried forward the reasoning of certain other great jurists grew and spread and lasted into our own time, while his own school slowly faded and was no longer transmitted as a living tradition. By the ordinary measures of worldly success, this might seem a kind of failure. A man builds a school of thought, and within a few generations it is gone, while his contemporary schools flourish for over 1,000 years. Where is the triumph in that? But this is precisely where we must look more deeply. For the fading of his school takes nothing away from him, and in a strange way it even fits the shape of his life. He was never a man who built for the sake of building monuments to himself. He had spent his whole life refusing the kinds of permanence and prominence that the world offers. The very ambition that might have driven another man to entrench his school, to gather power and patronage to ensure its survival, was the ambition he had renounced. He served the truth as he saw it, taught those who came to him, and left the results to God. That his school did not endure as an institution is, in a sense, of a piece with the man who never sought to build an empire of any kind, and his deeper legacy did endure, in a form truer to who he was. The sacred traditions he had so carefully preserved passed into the great collections that later scholars assembled, becoming part of the permanent foundation of the tradition. Generations who never knew his name received what he had helped to keep safe. His legal thought, too, lived on in the minds of those who came after, engaged with and carried forward by jurists who built their own systems. He left his mark not on a single institution, but on the deep substructure of the tradition itself, woven in so thoroughly that it could never be removed. But even this is not the heart of his legacy. The heart of it is something that no collection of traditions and no school of law can fully contain. It is the example of the man himself, the memory of a scholar who had everything the world admired and refused to be owned by any of it. This is what the later generations treasured most about him, and it is why he is remembered with such reverence even though his school is gone. They remembered not only what he taught but how he lived, the integrity, the simplicity, the unbending refusal to trade his sincerity for the favor of the powerful. They remembered a man who showed that it was possible to stand at the summit of honor and not be corrupted by it, because he had simply declined to live there. There is a lesson in this about the different kinds of permanence a life can have. Institutions rise and fall. Schools of thought flourish and fade. Even great works can be forgotten or superseded. But a certain kind of example, the example of a life lived with complete integrity, has a permanence of its own, quieter, but in some ways deeper. It survives not in buildings or institutions, but in the memory and the imagination of those who come after, in the simple, durable fact that once, long ago, a person showed that a thing could be done, that a man could possess greatness and refuse its rewards, that sincerity could be guarded even against the most subtle and powerful temptations. That example does not fade. It is handed down quietly, from one generation to the next, available to anyone who needs it. And so, when we set his life and his legacy side by side, we see that they tell a single, consistent story. The man who refused worldly permanence in his life left behind a worldly institution that did not last, and a deeper, quieter legacy that did. The school faded, as the things of the world fade. The example endured, as sincerity endures. It is almost as if his life and his legacy were arguing the same point, the point he spent his whole life making, that what the world builds and rewards is passing, and that what truly lasts is something the world can neither give nor take away. We should understand the company in which later generations placed him, for it tells us how he was remembered. He came to be counted among a small number of the great renunciants of the early generations, the men who were remembered above all for having turned away from the world to keep their hearts fixed on God. To be named among them was a particular kind of honor, an honor that had nothing to do with position or wealth or worldly success, and everything to do with the quality of the soul. We should be careful to understand what this renunciation truly meant, for the word can be misleading. It did not mean a hatred of the world, nor a withdrawal from all of life, nor a harsh and joyless severity. The renunciation of these early figures was something subtler and deeper. It meant holding the things of the world lightly, refusing to let them take hold of the heart, keeping one's deepest attachment fixed on what endures rather than on what passes. A renunciant in this sense was not a man who could not enjoy the world, but a man who was not owned by it, who could take it or leave it, who would not let the fear of losing it bend his conscience. This is exactly the freedom that Sufyan embodied. His simplicity, his refusal of position, his wariness of wealth and power were all expressions of this single inner freedom, the freedom of a heart that the world could not capture. He held everything loosely, and so nothing could be used to control him. He wanted little, and so he could not be bought. He feared losing nothing the world could take, and so he could not be threatened. This is the deep meaning of his renunciation. It was not a turning away from life in bitterness, but a holding of life with open hands, so that no part of it could close around his heart and squeeze the sincerity out of it. There is a paradox here worth contemplating slowly, for it sits at the very center of his example. The man who wanted the least was, in a sense, the freest and the richest of all. Those who chased the world's rewards, however much they gained, were never free, for they were always bound by the fear of losing what they had and the hunger for more. Sufyan, who refused those rewards, owned something they could never have: himself. His soul was his own, ungoverned by patron or fear or ambition. In the deepest sense, he was the wealthiest man in any room he entered, because he was the only one who needed nothing in it. And this is why his example reaches us across so vast a distance of time, with such quiet force. We live, most of us, in a kind of bondage we barely notice, bound by our wants, our fears, our hunger for approval and security, and more. We tell ourselves we are free, but our choices are shaped, often, by what we are afraid to lose. Sufyan stands as a witness to another possibility, the possibility of a freedom that comes not from having everything but from needing nothing, not from grasping but from letting go. He shows us that the heart can be kept free, that sincerity can be guarded, that a person can stand in the midst of all the world's temptations and remain entirely his own. It is a hard freedom, and we should not pretend otherwise. The price of it is everything the world offers, and that price is real. Most of us are not willing to pay it, and perhaps we are not asked to pay it in full. But there is something in his example that calls to the part of us that knows, however dimly, that we have sometimes sold pieces of ourselves too cheaply, traded a little of our integrity for comfort or approval without quite admitting it. His life holds up a mirror, gently, and in it we see both what we have done and what might yet be possible. We cannot all live as he lived, but we can all be reminded, by the memory of him, of what truly matters, and of the cost of forgetting it. And so, when we contemplate the company of renunciants in which he was remembered, we are really contemplating a particular vision of what a human life can be. Free, sincere, undivided, owned by nothing but the truth and by God. Sufyan lived that vision as fully as almost anyone of his age. He was poor in the world's goods and immeasurably rich in the one thing that lasts. And the memory of him, handed quietly down the generations, remains an invitation to all of us, to hold the world a little more lightly, and to guard the sincerity of our own hearts a little more carefully, for as long as we are given. And here we return, at the last, to the thing that makes his life endure most of all. It is not, in the end, the traditions he preserved, precious as they are, nor the school he founded, which faded. It is the man himself, and the question his life poses to every age, including our own. For when we strip away the dates and the cities and the titles, what remains of Sufyan al-Thawri is something very simple, and something that belongs to all of us. He was a man who could have had everything the world offers to those it admires, and who refused it, deliberately and repeatedly, because he loved the sincerity of his own heart more than he loved comfort, or influence, or honor, or ease. He understood something that is easy to say and hard to live. He understood that the rewards the world offers are never free, that each of them asks for something in return, and that the price is often paid in a currency we do not notice until it is spent. A little of our honesty here, a little of our independence there, a slow softening of the conscience until one day we find we are no longer quite the person we meant to be. He saw that danger clearly, and he refused to pay that price, even when the reward offered was great, and the cost seemed small. It is worth pausing, as we near the end of his story, to consider more deeply what sincerity meant to a man like Sufyan al-Thawri, for it is a word we use easily, and yet the thing itself is rarer and harder than we often suppose. To us, sincerity may mean simply meaning what we say, not being deliberately false. But for Sufyan, and for the tradition of the inner life to which he belonged, sincerity meant something far deeper and more demanding. The perfect alignment of the inner and the outer, the heart and the deed, so that nothing was done for show, nothing performed for the eyes of others, nothing tainted by the desire for praise or position or reward. This kind of sincerity is extraordinarily difficult, for the human heart is subtle, and its motives are mixed and often hidden even from itself. A person may do a good deed, and believe they do it purely for the sake of God or of goodness, while underneath, unnoticed, runs a quiet desire to be seen doing it, to be thought well of, to gain some advantage. The pure motive and the impure are tangled together, and it takes a rare and ruthless honesty to see them clearly, to detect the hidden self-interest beneath the apparent virtue. Sufyan possessed this honesty, this willingness to examine his own heart without flinching, and it was the foundation of his whole way of life. For once a person sees how easily the heart's motives are corrupted, how readily the desire for praise or gain slips in beneath even our best actions, they understand why Sufyan was so wary of everything that might feed those hidden desires. The favor of rulers, the admiration of crowds, the comforts of wealth and position, all of these were dangerous to him not because they were evil in themselves, but because they fed the subtle corruptions of the heart, the craving for status and approval and ease that could quietly poison the sincerity he prized above all. To keep his heart pure, he had to keep his distance from the things that would corrupt it, and so he did, throughout his life. There is a teaching attributed to him that captures this concern with great force. It is reported that he spoke of how the hardest thing for him to govern was his own intention, his own inner motive, because it kept shifting and turning beneath him, slipping from purity toward self-interest when he was not vigilant. We should treat the precise words gently, as a report passed down by those who treasured his memory. But the sentiment rings true to everything we know of him, and it reveals the depth of his self-knowledge. He understood that the battle for sincerity is fought not once but continually, in the hidden movements of the heart, and that it requires a vigilance that never rests. This helps us understand why he was so reluctant to take on public roles, so wary of fame and position. It was not merely that these things might tempt him to compromise on some particular matter. It was that they would subject his heart to a continual pressure toward insincerity, a constant feeding of the desire for approval and status that would make the inner battle for purity harder and harder to win. By keeping his life simple and obscure, he reduced the pressure on his heart, made the inner battle more winnable, kept the conditions in which sincerity could survive. His outer simplicity was in the service of his inner purity. The two were inseparable, and we can see, in this, the profound coherence of his life, how every part of it served a single end: the refusal of position, the wariness of rulers, the simplicity of his living, the discomfort with fame, the withdrawal in his final years. All of these flowed from a single source: the determination to protect the sincerity of his heart, to keep his inner life pure and aligned with his outer deeds, to serve God and the truth without the corruption of hidden self-interest. It was all one thing, all of a piece, a single sustained effort to remain sincere in a world full of forces that conspire against sincerity. A particular relevance lives in this for our own age, which is in much of what he did an age of performance, of living before an audience, of crafting an image to be admired by others. We are encouraged, now more than ever, to present ourselves, to seek attention and approval, to measure our worth by how we are seen. And in such an age, the danger to sincerity may be greater than it has ever been, for the pressure to perform, to live for the eyes of others, is constant and pervasive. Sufyan's life speaks to this danger with particular force. He shows us another way, the way of living for the unseen reality of the heart, rather than for the seen approval of others, of valuing what one truly is over how one appears. It is a difficult way, perhaps more difficult now than in his own time, but it is the way of sincerity, and his life testifies to its worth. We might ask ourselves, in the quiet of the night, how much of our own lives is lived for the eyes of others? How much of what we do is shaped, perhaps without our noticing, by the desire to be seen and approved? It is an uncomfortable question, but a valuable one, and Sufyan's life invites us to ask it. For he reminds us that there is a reality deeper than appearance, the reality of who we truly are in the hidden places of the heart, and that this reality is what finally matters, what we will carry with us when all the approval and the appearances have fallen away. To tend to this inner reality, to keep it pure and true, was the whole work of his life. Let us consider, too, the quality of his relationship with knowledge, for it was bound up with his sincerity in a way that illuminates both. Sufyan was, as we have seen, one of the great masters of the sacred traditions, a scholar of immense learning. But his learning was never separate from his devotion, never a mere accumulation of facts or a means to reputation. For him, knowledge was a sacred trust, to be received with reverence, preserved with care, and transmitted with perfect honesty. To handle knowledge carelessly, or to use it for personal gain, would have been, to him, a kind of betrayal of its sacredness. This is why his scrupulousness, as a transmitter of traditions, was not merely a scholarly technique, but a spiritual discipline. When he refused to pass on a tradition he was not sure of, when he insisted on the most rigorous standards of reliability, he was not only being a careful scholar, he was being faithful to the trust that knowledge represented. honest before God about what he truly knew and what he did not. His scholarship and his sincerity were one, both expressions of a single commitment to truth, in his knowledge and in his heart alike. And there is something deeply instructive in this union of learning and sincerity, for the two do not always go together. There have been many learned people who were not sincere, who used their knowledge for show or for gain, whose learning fed their pride rather than their devotion. And there have been many sincere people who were not learned. Sufyan united the two at the highest level, vast learning joined to perfect sincerity, and it is this union that made him not merely a great scholar, but a great soul, remembered not only for what he knew but for what he was. His knowledge served his sincerity, and his sincerity purified his knowledge, and together they made him the man he was. We should also reflect on the courage that his way of life required, for though we have touched on it, it deserves fuller acknowledgement. To refuse the favor of the powerful, in an age when that favor could mean the difference between comfort and hardship, between safety and danger, took real courage. To withdraw from public life rather than compromise, to accept obscurity and even hardship rather than betray his principles, took a courage of a quiet but profound kind. We sometimes imagine courage as a dramatic thing, displayed in battle or crisis. But there is a quieter courage, the courage to live by one's principles day after day, to refuse the easy compromises, to accept the costs of integrity over a whole lifetime. This was Sufyan's courage, and it was as real and as admirable as any displayed on a field of battle. For it is one thing to be brave in a single dramatic moment, when the blood is up and the eyes of others are upon us. It is another to be steadfast over a lifetime, in the countless small choices that no one sees, to refuse again and again the temptations of comfort and approval, to pay the daily price of integrity without applause or reward. This quieter, more sustained courage is in some ways the harder kind, for it has no drama to sustain it, no audience to admire it, only the steady inner commitment to do what is right, because it is right. Sufyan had this courage in abundance, and his whole life was a testimony to it, lived out not in grand gestures but in the patient, daily faithfulness to his principles. And we should not forget the cost of it all, the real price that his integrity exacted. To live as he lived, refusing position and wealth and the favor of the powerful, was to accept a harder life than he might otherwise have had. It was to forego the comforts and securities that his learning and standing could have brought him. It was to be thought strange by some, excessive by others, to bear his fame as a burden rather than to enjoy it as a reward. It was, finally, to withdraw from the world he had known, to spend his last years away from the center of things, in a kind of exile chosen for the sake of his conscience. These were real costs, paid in the currency of comfort and ease and belonging, and he paid them willingly, across a lifetime, for the sake of something he valued more. What he valued more was the integrity of his own soul, the purity of his heart before God, the alignment of his inner and outer life. And in choosing this over all the comforts and honors the world could offer, he made a statement, with his whole life, about what truly matters. He declared, not in words but in the manner of his living, that the state of the soul is more important than the comforts of the body, that sincerity is more precious than reputation, that integrity is worth more than ease. It is a statement that echoes across the centuries, as relevant now as it was then, perhaps more so in an age that has largely forgotten it. There is one more dimension of his life that deserves our attention, and it is the matter of how he was remembered by those who knew him and those who came after, for the love and reverence in which he was held tell us much about the man. He was remembered, by all accounts, with a deep affection and respect, treasured not only for his learning, but for the quality of his character, the sincerity and the integrity that shone through everything he did. The people of his age, and the generations that followed, sensed that here was someone rare, someone who lived what others merely professed, and they honored him for it. And there is a kind of vindication in this, in the way he was remembered, that speaks to the deep wisdom of his choices. He had refused the things the world counts as success, the position, the wealth, the worldly honor. And yet he gained something that those things could never have given him. The lasting love and reverence of his community, a place in the memory of his people that has endured for centuries. The men who took the positions he refused, who gained the wealth he forwent, are mostly forgotten now. But Sufyan, who refused it all, is remembered with honor and affection across more than 1,000 years. In choosing the integrity of his soul over the rewards of the world, he gained, as it turned out, the most lasting reward of all. This is not why he did it, of course. He did not refuse the world in order to gain a different kind of fame. He refused it for the sake of his soul, asking nothing in return. But there is a kind of justice in the outcome, a fittingness in the fact that the man who sought only sincerity, asking no reward, should be rewarded with a place in the hearts of his people that has lasted across the ages. It is as if the world, in the end, recognized and honored the very thing he had refused to seek, the integrity that he had valued above all the world could offer. Let us return, for a while, to the world of the early scholars among whom Sufyan lived and worked, for understanding the community of learning that surrounded him helps us to see his choices more clearly. In that age, the scholars of the sacred sciences formed a kind of community, bound together by their shared devotion to knowledge and by the chains of transmission that connected teacher to student across the generations. They knew one another, studied with one another, debated and corresponded and traveled great distances to learn from one another. It was a living network of learning, stretching across the cities of the Muslim world, and Sufyan was one of its most respected members.